Yes, so I'd like to welcome everyone to this final event in the Bristol Radical History Group's fantastic series of talks commemorating and celebrating the history of radical Black resistance to racism and oppression in the UK. Over the last fortnight, there have been some wonderful talks, history walks and other events commemorating the anniversaries, both of course, the murder of George Floyd on May the 25th, and of course today's anniversary of the toppling of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston by the people of Bristol. I wouldn't be so boastful as to say that we've saved the best for last, but it does give me great pleasure to welcome award-winning filmmaker George Amponsah to talk about his excellent feature-length documentary, Black Power, A British Story of Resistance. I first became a fan of George's work after watching his BAFTA-nominated film, The Hard Stop. This follows the lives of two of Mark Duggan's friends in the aftermath of his death at the hands of the police during his arrest and the subsequent 2011 Tottenham uprisings. But George has made many other brilliant documentaries exploring different facets of the Black experience, from the fighting spirit about young boxers in Ghana to the importance of being elegant about the strange cult of fashion around Congolese musician Papa Wemba. And more recently, he's directed a 6-part series, Enslaved, uncovering the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade as revealed by underwater archaeology, which sounds absolutely fascinating, and I'll certainly be finding and watching. But tonight, we're going to talk about British Black Power. So, George, my first question to you is, how much did you know about British Black Power before you got involved with making the film?
Very little is a short answer to that question, Rosie.
Okay.
Very little. I'd heard of Darkest. I knew about Darkest House. I'm old enough to remember programs like Bandung File and The Devil's Advocate. And I knew about Michael X because I was someone who was an adherent of Malcolm X. And I read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was still a teenager.
Yeah.
And as a consequence of knowing all about Malcolm X, I had heard about a man called Michael X in this country, and I knew he emanated from around West London and Notting Hill, and I knew he had started some sort of a Black Power group, but had then subsequently been discredited. That's pretty much it, you know. That's all I knew.
So, what was it about the project that appealed to you? How did the project for the film start?
The project started with a phone call or an email from my agent saying, "Would you like to be involved in a documentary about the British Black Power movement, exec produced by Steve McQueen?" It's kind of a no-brainer. What does the Pope wear a funny shaped hat? The answer to that question, definitely, all day long. And but I must admit, I remember thinking, is this a 90-minute film? What's the scope of this? What's the scope of this story? And then as I found out more about it, the question I kept asking myself was, why do I not know about this? Why is it? And you know, one question got answered, which was, yes, it's definitely a 90-minute film, and then some, because it's a massive story. And then answering that question provoked another question, which was, why on earth have I not heard about this story? Why has this history been submerged, it seems to me?
Absolutely. I mean, what, as a Black child growing up in Britain, what did you learn about Black history?
Well, I went to a very good school. I was quite privileged. I went to a very good school, and you know, so-called we learned there was a chapter in our history lessons at A-level history about the American Civil Rights Movement. They didn't really talk about the Black Power movement. They talked about the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King, you know, and you know, the Montgomery marches and etc. But they didn't talk about Malcolm X. And they certainly didn't talk about Huey P. Newton or Bobby Seale or Eldridge Cleaver. But be that as it may, they did cover American civil rights. What they did not cover was any form of Black power history emanating from this country. And you're being taught in a British school about British history. Of course, you learn all about Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I and Sir Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake. But, you know, when it comes to recent history as pertains to Black people, then absolutely not. And I'm telling you all something you already know. And this is why we're here.
Well, because for anyone watching, I did my PhD on the history of British Black Power movement, and I did that PhD. I finished it in 2008, and it took me about 5 years to write it. And at that time, there was very, 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 very little about it anywhere. And I came to do that PhD because I was fascinated by the American civil rights movement, but it's very well covered. So I was looking for something that hadn't been studied very much, and slowly discovered, I was looking at civil rights in Britain, and then there wasn't much parallel. But then Black Power, there's a massive parallel between what's happening in America and Britain. And so actually I didn't know anything at all about it either. And I didn't even know there was a British Black Power movement before I stumbled upon it. And then I discovered that no one else had really written anything about it. So it was great. What of the things you discovered in your research of the film most surprised you?
Well, I was quite surprised to find that someone called Rosie Wild had written a whole PhD thesis about this subject matter. That was quite a shock, and and gone so much in depth, because obviously, in researching the subject matter, we then had to access all of the available information on this story. But what surprised me, as I said before, was the scope, the amount of people who were involved, the depth and the breadth of the Black Power movement in this country. It wasn't just Notting Hill. It was all over London, and it wasn't just London. It was in the regions, and it was in Manchester and Bristol and in Birmingham and Cardiff. What surprised me as well was, I'll give you an example. The group who are featured in the film, called the Black Liberation Front, they are so clandestine a group. There's barely anything on them at all, anywhere on the internet and Wikipedia or anything. Now, one of the main members, one of the key members of the Black Liberation Front is my good friend, Menelik Shabazz. I've known Menelik for about 25 years through our connection as filmmakers. And Menelik's someone I look up to as an older brother kind of figure, as a mentor kind of person, because he was one of the pioneering Black British filmmakers with films such as Burning an Illusion. In the course of my research, several people mentioned that you should talk to Menelik about the Black Liberation Front. And I'd got quite a long way into accessing contributors for the documentary. And by this time, we found people from the British Black Power movement and from the Black Unity and Freedom Party and other groups, but no one from the Black Liberation Front. So I thought, well, look, let me give Menelik a call. And I knew he was in Zimbabwe, making a series out there. So I gave him a ring and I said, Menelik, look, how's it going? How's the filming going, etc. I said, look, your name keeps coming up in connection with this group, the Black Liberation Front. I'm making a documentary at the moment about the British Black Power movement. So can you tell me what your involvement was? And then the phone went silent for about 15 seconds. It was really dramatic. It's quite mysterious. When he was like, and I thought, is he gonna hang up, or is he? And I guess he was contemplating whether he wanted to carry on talking to me or what. And he said, yeah, I was involved. And then he started talking for about another hour about his involvement. And then he gave me the connections to speak to Zainab Abbas.
Brilliant.
To speak to Tony Sinaris, as he's called in the film, and to speak to Ansel Wong. And he told me the whole story about the Black Liberation Front and what they went through and what they experienced. But he also said, we were a clandestine group. We didn't want photographs taken of us because we didn't want MI5 or the security services knowing who we were and who our members were and what the inside of our meetings looked like. So we don't have any visual records of what we were doing. In fact, a lot of us operated under pseudonyms. And I thought, oh yeah, well, that's why he's called Menelik Shabazz. I always thought he'd just taken the name off Malcolm X, and it sounded a cool sort of stage name kind of thing for a filmmaker. So it was an eye opener, and it gave me a sense of, actually, this is a hidden history for kind of two reasons. One, the state doesn't, it's an inconvenient and somewhat embarrassing truth. And two, on the other side, there's people who, as Tony Sinari said, still prefer to be clandestine. Tony Sinari from the Black Liberation Front said, I don't, even my children don't know what I was involved in with the Black Power movement in Britain.
Wow. Wow, absolutely. So was Menelik a main entry point into the fantastic people you got to interview?
Menelik was a main entry point into the Black Liberation Front side of it.
Right.
Whereas with the Black Panthers, they were more willing to speak, and they were much more, as you know, much more to the forefront.
Yeah.
Darkest How,
Leela Hassan. Oh no, she was beautiful.
Arthur Jones LeQuoin.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I haven't actually watched the film or really thought about it for a few months. To be honest with you, so I'm just trying to recall some of them because I spent a whole year doing nothing else and thinking about it day and night and dreaming about it, and it's been quite therapeutic to sort of put it to one side. So just forgive me if I have to think of for a few seconds to recall some of the names. But yeah, Alfie Jones LeQuoin, Darkest How, Barbara Beese, Farouk Dundee. These were all names that they're a Wikipedia search away, and they just pop up, and and the photographs are there as well, courtesy of the likes of Neil Kenlock, the photographer. Yeah,
his photos are absolutely fantastic. As someone who knows the history very well, so most of what was in the film historically wasn't news to me, but it was amazing to see photos and footage from films of the people and places that I've only read about in archival documents. It really brought it all to life. How hard was it to find all that footage, and where did it come from, and how did you root it out?
To be honest with you, Rosie, this would be a conversation probably best had with Alex, he's on the end credits as our archive producer, because that's his speciality. That's what he does, and that's what he spent a year doing, is digging up this archive. A lot of it came from the BBC. Some of it came from Person Archive, but not much. As I said, they weren't really in the business of taking photographs of each other. Not to mention the fact that it wasn't as it is now, where everyone can take photographs of everything that they do from minute to minute, because of the technology we have now. So the archive was scarce. I at first, when to begin with, when I started making the film, I honestly thought that part of the story might have to be that there's very little archive. Most of this was a clandestine movement. The state has since redacted images that it has, or they don't want to release images because these were images that were taken by covert operators, as in undercover police people. So I really didn't think there'd be enough visually, but actually there was. I felt that really in the balance of things, looking back at it, I think there was enough visual imagery with which to tell the story without having to resort to, you know, gimmicky devices such as, well, it's not always gimmicky, but it could be, you know, drama reconstruction or animation or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm very tired of seeing animation in documentaries when you're like, you know, if you haven't got the visuals for it, don't cover it. So you were saying that you was like, you had a privileged, your school was a good school. So, and you didn't know about this Black Power history. So growing up yourself in London in the 70s and 80s, would that be right? How, I mean, what was your experience as a Black person growing up, and did anything that you personally experienced chime with what you learned from the film?
Yeah, I can answer that question. You see, look, I was a hip hop kid, Rosie. So by the time I was about 14 or 15, I was listening to the early iterations of hip hop music, electro music. And that, a lot of that came from people who called themselves Africa Bambaataa. And you had a label called Tommy Boy, and they released a song called Malcolm X, No Sellout. This is an electro song, and it had a hip hop, it was cutting and scratching the speeches of Malcolm X. So I heard that when I was 14 or 15, and plus I was obsessed with this new form of music, and it connected me to that kind of ideology quite early on. So of course I read Malcolm X when I was about 16, the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And so therefore I was quite conscious, and, you know, and then what followed was reading, you know, things like Soul on Ice, Eldridge Cleaver, and Solid Dad Brother by George Jackson, etc., etc.
And in terms of your own personal experience, did you have any, you know, experience of being hassled by the police and racism of your own?
Yeah, all the time. You know, it's a daily thing, Rosie, as a Black person. I probably experience racism today, but I'm just not, it's just, you just have to get on with it, because otherwise, you know, what you're going to do, you probably end up in a funny farm, or you're, you know, in serious trouble.
Yeah.
So that's the answer to that question.
So that's quite segues very well into my next question, is that one of the things that I was really impressed by in the film is that it's really compelling, but it's not sensationalist. It really doesn't, it's quite an accurate depiction of British Black Power as I researched it. And I did wonder when I was watching the film whether that would have been the case if it hadn't been made by Black people, because a lot of the white writing about British Black Power I've come across, you know, they kind of react to the superficial elements of it, like the fiery language and the kind of and the scary art side of it, but they don't get into the meat of it, into the substance, because they don't understand that it was dealing with real things and people's lived experience, everyday experience. So I was wondering, you know, whether you think it was really important that Black people made this documentary.
I think it was really important that I made the documentary, a Black person. So I guess, yeah, I do think it's important. Definitely. You know, I thought for me, it was a process of meeting people that I hold in very high esteem. Automatically, I said I wasn't aware of this movement, but I became aware of it very quickly. And at that point, it's like, I want to meet these people. These people are what I, you know, from the culture, from where my parents come from in Ghana, you have to consider these people as your aunties and uncles. I'm talking about Layla Hassan Howe and Zainab Abbas and Farouk Dondi, you know, and Charlie Phillips and Linton Kwesi Johnson. So it was just an honor and a privilege to meet them, and it was, you know, it was a learning process. I'm turned up with the camera and just said, tell me something that I need to know. I'm all ears.
And were the people did you find people were happy to talk to you on the whole? Or, I mean, you've mentioned before some people wanted to, retain their anonymity. Were there people you really wanted to talk to who wouldn't?
There was a couple of people who, for the reasons of their own, didn't want to talk. I don't think I even want to mention their names. But you know what? Honestly, I'm just left with the lasting memory of all the people who did want to talk. And I think it's important to say that we did it in 2 hits because, for whatever reason, to begin with, I thought to myself, I can tell this story as audio interviews using archive. So, some of you will have seen film, say, for instance, a film like Senna or Maradona, and I kind of had some of those films in my mind. And I thought, well, maybe that's an appropriate way to go. And we'll get the audio interviews of people, and then we'll find the archive to tell the story visually. And it just seemed like a way to go. Of course, so I went and did about 15 of these audio interviews with the various contributors, and then realized we do not have enough visual material to cover this. And then I realized, and by this point, we were deep into the pandemic. And what you're talking about is the proposition is to be interviewing people in their homes. And these are people from the Black and Asian communities during a pandemic, which reportedly is disproportionately killing people of color. And they all turned up to be interviewed with a microphone, on audio. But then I realized that we can't make this film like this. We have not got enough visual material. And then I realized, what are you doing, George? These people are the archive, if that makes sense. Their faces are the story. Who they are is crucial to telling this story. They're heroes, and furthermore, they're survivors of what I would consider to be a form of warfare. And they absolutely must be on camera. And then I thought about, films that I really love like films like Reds with Warren Beatty, and more recently the Band of Brothers series, which I was obsessed by. And it's just interviewing people against a black backdrop. But it's, it's somehow very dramatic to have that negative space behind people. And also I thought, well, it couldn't be more appropriate, given that this is a story of Black power. And so then I've gone back and asked all of those 15, 20 contributors to come back and be interviewed again. And they all did. I got a bit of stick off the likes of Linton Kwesi Johnson. But I had to take that. And he turned up and delivered again. Linton's a man who's, he's a typical poet. I've been doing this for about 25 years. So you'll interview someone and they'll speak for 2 or 3 hours. And out of that, you'll get 20 minutes of good stuff. Linton comes along and just speaks for 20 minutes. And that is all you need. It's all on point. And that's how you're dealing with someone who's, a top-notch person in terms of, a master of words, a wordsmith, a poet.
I found Linton, found it terrifying interviewing Linton Kwesi Johnson, I must admit, because
hard, but yeah, it is a bit, the surface could seem a bit scary to people.
Yeah, and I have so much respect for him as well. And I was late to our interview, which was the worst possible way to start it. But no,
you don't want to be late.
No, I know.
Time is of the essence with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the historian in me, when I was watching the film, I was thinking, oh wow, all these interviews, because you interviewed so many people that I would have loved to and didn't for my PhD. Is there any way that these interviews will be made public or archived in any way?
I think they're part of a BBC schools, BBC education resource now.
Okay.
I'm very happy about it. And that went a long way with a lot of the contributors as well, to know that. And that's part of the objective of this exercise, is to put in place a missing part of British history not Black history to be accessed in the month of October, but British history to be accessed every day of the year.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another thing that I found fascinating about the film was the decision to also interview white policemen, and I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that.
I don't know if that was a decision at all. I mean, like I said, British history. Who can speak to this history? You know, there's always at least two sides to a story. There's always two sides of the story, and those police officers, you know, they got my respect for turning up to and standing up to be counted in a documentary called Black Power, a British story of resistance. And they did exactly what I wanted them to do, which was just to speak honestly and candidly about their experiences of that time. And I didn't want people to turn up and offer platitudes and, you know, and be apologetic, or to try and be on, you know, whatever woke or whatever the phrase is. I just wanted, you know, that's what you want in a documentary. You want different sides of a debate or an argument, or, as I said before, a war. And they got my admiration. They really did. I've seen it before in a documentary about the Black Panthers in America. I'm trying to remember. It might be something. I think it might be Black Panther: The Vanguard of the Revolution, where they had a lot of the ex-FBI people. You know, and some of them were the shooters, because as we know, in America, these events were very, very violent indeed, and bloody. And you know, we've got Daniel Kaluuya doing the voiceover narration, and as many of you might have seen his portrayal of Fred Hampton, and the murder, the cold-blooded murder of Fred Hampton is just a prime example of what was happening all the time in America during that era, during the confrontation between the Black Panther Party over there and law enforcement in America. But you know, in this country, it wasn't as violent, thank God. We don't have that same kind of gun culture, but you know, it was still a war. And you know, I like the fact that one of those officers, Alan, I think it was very unapologetic. You know, very, as far as he was concerned, the mangrove was a policing issue. There was drugs there, there was crime coming out there, and our job was to go and stop it. Our job is that we're there to lock people up, you know. And he didn't see himself as racist. He saw himself as a police officer doing a job, you know. So I was very grateful to have his contribution in our documentary.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's definitely brave to turn up in a Black Power documentary and claim that the prejudiced people are Black people against the police.
You know, I'll give you an example of Alan, God bless him. The subject of Stephen Lawrence came up, because I was saying, well, it's official that the Metropolitan Police are racist because it came out in the Macpherson report. And his view on the Stephen Lawrence incident was that actually, if Dwayne Brooks hadn't been freaking out and acting so aggressively when the first police officers had turned up, then they would have treated him differently. And that just, you know, that's the mindset. You know, never mind the fact that you've got someone whose best friend has just been murdered in front of them, who was almost murdered themselves, who is severely traumatized, who'd be acting as hysterical as anyone would be in that situation. But no, he was acting in an aggressive manner to the point where we as police officers felt that he must have been involved in some kind of crime, some sort of aggressive sort of behavior to have therefore warranted the death of his friend. And furthermore, he may have had something to do with the death of his friend. And it's that gives you a kind of you know, an indication of the mindset.
I rewatched the film this afternoon, and I was very struck by the phrase boisterous hostility that one of the policemen used to describe Black communities. And
I think that was probably Alan as well. But you know, I don't want. You know, these things are complex as well, and that's another thing Alan said. You know, they are complex, and he admitted, we didn't put it in the film. It was in a cut almost right up until the end, and we took it out. And he pretty much said, look, I've got to admit, he said, well, I've got Black people in my family, and you know, that old chestnut. And you know, he also said, but I have to admit, I don't know. I will never know what it's like to be a Black person, because I'm not. I don't know what it's like to walk into a pub and have everyone look at you or treat you differently because of the color of your skin, because I've never experienced that. And that was the kind of honesty that for me personally, I'm looking for from contributors in a documentary.
Absolutely. It feels to me like the policing of Black communities is a you know, a very important theme, both in the Black Power film, but also obviously in the hard stop. And it seems, you know, at the heart of the problem of race relations in lots of ways is the police's treatment of Black communities. And I wondered, you know, as someone who's examined this in different contexts, how, you know, whether you see any progress being made there between the Black Power era and the Mark Duggan era.
Yeah, I think I see progress being made, but I also see that there's still a lot of progress that is still needed to come. I just don't think we're in a position where we're in any way in a position to be resting on laurels or to be writing self-congratulatory race reports, or you know, we you know, there's still work to be done, and I think the police have come some way. They, you know, in terms of racism, and so is this society, but there's still some way to go, you know, and it's just as simple as that. You know, I remember with the Hard Stop screening it to an audience of officers from the Met. And after the lights came up, one of the officers said, then it was kind of 50-50 Black and white officers. And one of the white officers said, look, it's a good film, George, we appreciate it, it's well made, it's very professional, but what's the point? What's the message? What are you trying to tell us? And I said, well, the message I think you can see at that from the end, the text at the end of the film, which says that since 1990, there's been, I think, 2,000 deaths in police custody, but there's never been a conviction to date of an officer relating to any of those incidents. And another quote at the end is from Leo Tolstoy, and the quote says, everyone wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. And I was saying, and so therefore the meaning that we're trying to get at is that there needs to be more change. There still needs to be more change. And that then sparked off a debate amongst these officers, which seemed to be pretty much divided amongst the Black and the white ones, which was the white ones saying, look, well, a lot has changed, and you know, actually, blah, 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 and it's not like since the bad old days, and we've done this and we've done that. And then the other side of the argument saying, yeah, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. There's still a lot needs to be changed. And I'll never forget one of the officers who was one of the Black officers who I just remember, it's a bit weird because one minute I was sort of looking at him at the other side of this auditorium. And the next minute, the guy was sort of standing next to me, kind of whispering in my ear. And he said, look, George, I like your film. And he said, one thing you should know, he said, look, since I've been doing my job, he says, I've always been aware that where we do a stop, if it's a hard stop or if it's an arrest or something like that, when I'm there, I always have the impression that my white colleagues, counterparts, modify their behavior because of my presence. And that's what he said.
So your film, do you feel that even though your films look at disparate subjects, do you feel that there are unifying themes that tie them all together, that they're bits of a jigsaw in a larger coherent picture? Or
I think the unifying theme, it's a bit, I don't know, I'm a bit hesitant to say this, but if there's a unifying theme, then it's probably me in some way, shape or form. Yeah, I don't know really what, I haven't thought about. Yeah, if I look at it, there tends to be, the question of identity seems to crop up quite a lot. But yeah, I'm not really sure what the unifying theme would be.
You, in your Enslaved series, you had Afua Hirsch, didn't you? I thought her book about her identity was absolutely fascinating, brilliant book, and a very worthy theme to explore in great detail.
Yeah, British.
Yeah. So, talking about you, how did you get into filmmaking?
Yeah, I went to art college and I studied photography, and I specifically went to North East London Polytechnic, which then turned into University of East London, because I heard they had a great film department, and actually they really did. They had a great film department with great equipment, which none of the teachers knew how to use. But I then quickly befriended the technician, who was a chap called Dean Todd. And I got my hands on all of this equipment, Super 8 cameras, 16mm cameras, 16mm Steenbecks. They had U-matic video cameras, and then after that SVHS, and the edit suites at the time, which were linear edit suites. So you had two machines, two VCRs, and you had a controller in the middle with the two dials, and a third machine that you'd record onto. And that's when I first started making films. And my first films were just a mishmash of photography, Super 8 footage, 16mm footage, and video footage. I'll just go and shoot anything and everything, usually with some sort of regard towards some question of Black British identity, and things that were going on in my mind, the things that I was influenced by, and those were my first films, and those were the films that I submitted to the National Film and Television School to try and gain entry, and I managed to get in 1997 to do the documentary course.
What drew you specifically to documentary making?
Because I couldn't write a script. I couldn't. I still find writing hard. I wanted to make films, but I actually, my first love was drama. It's not my. I just love films, and my first love was films like by Martin Scorsese, like Mean Streets, and I was kind of obsessed with that. There was actually a period of time in my early 20s when I couldn't really get to sleep at night unless I watched Mean Streets on my VCR, and then it had a kind of sedative effect on me, and then I'd go to sleep. So I must have watched that film about 20 times. But I just wanted to make films, and they sort of came out as documentaries, I suppose, because the first films were documentaries. The Lumiere brothers and all that kind of thing.
Right, I did not know
that. Yeah, some train entering a station, or the first films were just recordings of life, and by the time I got to the National Film and Television School, I was fortunate that I got there, and the person running the course was running the course, and he still is, Dick Fontaine, my good friend Dick. and he said, look, basically, whatever you can think to do and whatever you are, it's okay. The sky's the limit, you know. And also, I quickly found out, and we gravitated towards each other, because I found out he'd made the first documentary that I'd ever really paid attention to and recorded on my VCR, on VHS, and rewatched countless times. Not because it was a documentary, but because it was a documentary about hip hop. It was an arena special, and it's a 1-hour film called Beat This, A Hip Hop History, which went back to the beginning, to Grandmaster Flash, to Africa Bambaataa, to, you know, Soul Sonic Force, and it was brilliant, shot on 16mm. And I'd watched that countless times. It was like, because I watched that not because I wanted to learn about documentary, but I wanted to see what the latest breakdancing moves were and what the latest graffiti styles were coming out of New York in the early 80s. Anyway, I rocked up at the National Film and Television School in 1996 or 97, and the head of the course is the person who directed that documentary.
Wow, fate.
Yeah.
Amazing. So what, you've mentioned Martin Scorsese, and you said you had great respect for Menelik Shabazz. What other filmmakers have inspired you?
Steve McQueen. You know, I've just come back from the Sheffield Documentary Film Festival, and I've got a preview, a sneak preview of the first episode of Steve's film called Uprising, which sort of picks up where Black Power leaves off. Because we spend around about the late 70s. Now we've got the 80s. 1981 was a new crossfire, which was a massacre, a murder of 13 Black people, as we know. And that's where the story picks up. And that's what led to the Brixton riots and the subsequent riots thereafter. In 1985, we had the Broadwater Farm. And that's what, you know, so, and we covered that in the Heartstop. But the first episode of this 3-part series, which will be available to everyone on BBC, I think later on this year, is fantastic. It really is. And it's everything. It's so painful and emotional, but somehow it feels a bit cathartic as well. You know, again, this is a history that has been submerged. It hasn't been told, but the pain and the trauma is still there. And that's why there's still that potential for something to spark, as we saw in 2011, because these things haven't been addressed. Well, now, you know, Steve and people like him are giving us that opportunity to do it, because there's no question in my mind, if it wasn't for Steve McQueen, I would not have been involved in making a documentary called Black Power, a British story resistance. It just wouldn't have happened. He's done what he's done and got the highest accolade award that you can get in our industry in America, and he's used that clout to come and do these things. You know, I'm sure a lot of you would have seen his anthology, as he likes to call it, Small Acts.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
But he didn't want to stop there, and that's where these documentaries have come from. And I kind of think I might be sort of maybe filling in a few blanks myself, but I know I've heard through the grapevine that Steve's good friend Martin Scorsese, Steve's mentor, has possibly whispered in Steve's ear and said, "Steve, you're a great filmmaker. I think you're fantastic. You're a great kid, and I think you're gonna go as high as you can, but you need to make documentaries and you'll be even better." Because Martin Scorsese has always been a documentary filmmaker, and I've read everything he's written. I've read, and he always says that his films are born out of documentary. And if there's anything good about his films, it's because he comes from documentaries. You know, he said when he was making The Irishman, he got some of his freedom and some of his approach came from the documentary he was making at the time about Bob Dylan. So that's I think that might be what's inspired Steve to do what he's done, to get these documentaries made.
Oh, it's amazing, absolutely amazing. It does feel like, you know, does feel like there's a moment where Black history, British Black history in particular, is breaking through into the mainstream. I mean, do you think that can't surely just be because of Steve McQueen? Or maybe you're saying it can. But
I'm sure he'd say the same. It's not just because of him, but you know, it does feel like, yeah, it's clearly there's a bit of a zeitgeist. There's a moment. Look, these films were being made before last year, before George Floyd.
Yeah.
Enslaved was made, which is available to watch on BBC iPlayer. Just do a little plug for that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, you can watch all episodes on BBC iPlayer currently. And we were in Bristol in 2019 filming the Coulson statue with Afua Hirsch and a Bristolian poet. His name I can't remember, but a great chap. He's a good guy and a brilliant.
Lawrence who? Was it Lawrence who?
Yeah. Lawrence, yes. Right. Yeah. And in front of the statue and saying this is a disgrace. What is it? Look, can we just tell the truth about who this man was and what he was involved in? Because it's an insult to our intelligence as Black people. It's, you know, just tell the truth. We're not even saying take the statue down. We're saying just add something on the plaque to say what he was involved in. And a year later, I'm watching on the news as this statue is being pulled down and dragged to the riverbank, which was very appropriate in my view. That it was. I know it's since been retrieved, and I think they've got it in the museum. But it's very appropriate that it was dragged to the river and drowned, quote unquote, because that was it's beneath at the bottom of the ocean is a murder site. That's where it was, and that's why in Enslaved, a lot of the series is about underwater, deep sea diving and underwater excavation. Because, like, you know, if you want to see the mementos of the Holocaust, you go to Auschwitz, go to Poland, or you Dachau, and you do, you know, but in Germany, and you see the remnants. Well, for the slave trades, a lot of that is at the bottom of the ocean. And so that's what we covered in Enslaved.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. That seems to me like a good time to throw questions out to our audience. So I just want to reiterate to everyone again that you can put a question in the chat and I can put it to George, or you can raise your hand and I shall change my view to gallery view and ask the question yourself. So there is also already a question in the chat from Steve, which I shall read out. So Steve's saying, while we look across to the US civil rights movement, do you, George, or me, Rosie, or anyone know where there was a glance from the British Black Power movement across to the Irish civil rights movement in the late 60s or early 70s?
I mean, you might know a bit about this, Rosie. I know from things that were told to me by contributors that weren't cut into the film, that there were definite links with the IRA, definite links. I'm talking about the Black Liberation Front, and yeah, there were links, and there were ideas about armed struggle as well, consequently. And of course, this would have been of great interest to this, you know, the special branch or MI5, or whoever those operatives were, who were tasked to you know, with monitoring Black Power groups.
Yeah, I mean, we have in our audience here Evelyn Lovers, who with me, well, she's a real expert on the special branch and police monitoring. And I was going to ask you, Evelyn, actually, because I certainly know that Black Power groups supported the Irish civil rights movement as and what was happening in Ireland as an anti-colonialist movement. So they identified with the Irish on that front. But I'm just thinking now that actually Evelyn and I had a really, really good look through all the special branch files we could find that pertained to Black Power, and there wasn't very much. Maybe Evelyn will contradict me. There wasn't very much about Irish civil rights movement, so Special Branch didn't know much about what was going on.
Okay, I've just realised I can unmute myself, so I've unmuted. Yeah, I've just been reading the autobiography of Bernadette Devlin, and certainly Bernadette Devlin and Eamon McCann and people from People's Democracy and the Irish civil rights movement went over to the States, and there were several gestures of mutual solidarity with the Black Panthers. So I suppose trying to find the other link there back to the British Black Power movement. So yeah, that would be interesting if Evelyn could add anything to that.
Well, like Rosie said, we couldn't find a lot, but that is also very much limited with what was available by way of files. We went to the National Archives to find files, and we also found that there's still a lot of files retained, not disclosed. We found several files. Big files with loads of documents in there that we couldn't look into. The other thing is that there's now the ongoing undercover policing inquiry, an official inquiry into the squads, the secret squads that infiltrated movements, which we've discussed last week, that it was very difficult for Special Branch to infiltrate Black Power groups. Because of the simple fact that they didn't have Black officers. They first started hiring Black officers in 1967, and they weren't high enough up the ladder to become an infiltrator, an undercover officer in that time. What we do expect, there is a lot of disclosure from the inquiry, from like I'm currently, as we speak, going through documents from the period of the late I think it's the late 70s to 74 to 82, so that would be a time of interest. But we also, again, we find that groups that were infiltrated that they don't want to disclose stuff about. There's still major gaps in our knowledge and in our possible knowledge, and going through that. The files that have been disclosed are redacted for names and for the most interesting stuff. So while there is a lot disclosed, there's also a lot not disclosed yet. And for the links that we have seen so far, it's mostly about, like Steve said, solidarity campaigns, Trotskyist groups, other leftist groups, founding solidarity committees when Black people were on trial or in prison. Solidarity, Black groups paying solidarity with hunger strikes and with the IRA, but we haven't seen a lot about concrete thoughts about the armed struggle. But on the other hand, you can also imagine that those that were very private discussions, those were very private discussions, and not necessarily would an undercover officer have been privy to that.
There's two things this is making me think is, George, I'm just so desperate to hear all your interviews. I'm now thinking, can't you write a book with the transcriptions of just all the interviews? Can we not? It's just
you could get involved in that, Rosie.
Yes, I will. If I get to listen to the interviews, I'll gladly write a book for you about them.
Yeah, that would be great. This is such important material, and a lot of people are of a certain age now. Of course, you were just in time interviewing them. I guess people are dying.
Yeah,
that were active in those times.
I think you're absolutely right, Evelyn. To be honest, Steve said the same. This film it should have been made in 10 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
Coulda, shoulda, woulda, and all that. It's been made now.
I
Apparently,
think,
the time is ripe now.
yeah,
There's
I think
space for
several people I interviewed in the early 2000s for my PhD have since died. So yeah, absolutely.
People even now, we couldn't get Althea because, you know, one, she's in Trinidad, and two, she was very ill, you know, and it's in the middle of a pandemic.
Really tragic.
We couldn't get her, and you know, 10 years ago, the man himself would have been interviewed, wouldn't he, for our film, Dark as Hell?
Absolutely. The other Rosie, the original Rosie from the Bristol Radical History Groups, had her hand up for a while. So,
thank you, Rosie. George, really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you so much. You mentioned that that it was really important for you, you know, to interview and film. The faces are shown because, you know, in the Black Power movement, through your cinemascope, that that their history is told, you know, as a primary source. Now, I'm currently writing a book that goes, it's about the history of a slave ship in 1693. And of course, it's pretty much impossible, you know, to in any way, you know, to have any primary sources, of course, about what those victims or you know, victims of enslavement went through. And I was very interested at the beginning that it was briefly mentioned by Rosie. Is it a film you're undertaking at the moment about nautical archaeology? About slave ships, is that correct?
It's a film. It's a series that was made in 2018. Was it 2018 or 2019? Anyway, and it's called Enslaved, and it's a 4-part series, and it's on BBC iPlayer. So I was involved in that. I directed all 4 episodes with Samuel L. Jackson as a presenter, who's brilliant, and Afua Hirsch, who's also one of the presenters, who's also a brilliant person and someone I consider a friend.
Thank you.
We'll all be,
I'll look it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So will I. Roger, you have your hand. Roger, also from the Bristol Radical History Group.
Yeah, I was really interested to hear that Steve McQueen's making this film about the 1981 riots. And I just wondered, what one of the most fascinating, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I studied it in my PhD, looking at the 81 riots and the riots in St Paul's in Bristol. And one of the fascinating elements of, say, the St Paul's incident in 1980 was the fact that it was a vanguard for riots that occurred in other areas of Bristol. So the riot, for example, in St Paul's occurred on the Wednesday, and then there were 2 nights of very serious rioting in a mainly white working class estate of Southmead. There was also an attempted riot which was suppressed by the police in Knoll West, another mainly white working class estate, and that pattern was replicated in 1981. And one of the most interesting figures about 1981 was that 2/3 of the 4,000 people who were arrested, around 4,000 I think it was, or went to court, were white. So I just wondered if, you know, with your sneak preview, whether Steve's actually looking into that fascinating aspect of it, where inner city mixed, you know, multiracial areas became a vanguard for other areas that also suffered, from my experience of talking to people, bad policing.
What I saw was the first part of a trilogy. So I saw part 1, right, which just leads up to the fire. So we haven't got to the riots yet. There is no way Steve, and I should mention James Rogan is also involved in it, so they're co-directing. They're not going to miss that. These words could come back to haunt me. They're not going to miss that. We didn't really, in Black Power, we didn't really, for certain reasons, we didn't feel able to cover. It's mentioned because Dark as Hell was very concerned that, and he was concerned, he was inspired by his uncle CLR James to try and unify the white working class with these black radical groups because of common interest. And for instance, we mention it in the film, at the Mangrove trial, they knew they couldn't get an all black jury. That wasn't gonna happen. There's no way. They tried, but it's never gonna happen. That became more about winding up the judge than anything that was actually gonna happen in reality. But then as a plan B to that was to get white working class members of the jury. Because as far as Darcus Howe was concerned, these were people who were much more likely than their middle class counterparts to have experienced police brutality, the everyday police brutality and injustice. And he got that mindset from his uncle. The British Black Panther movement, they were very much about trying to unify those groups, black radical groups and white working class groups. In terms of that film, I mean, as far as I know, I haven't seen parts 2 and 3, but as far as I know, in Brixton, the Brixton riots was a significant amount of white people that were involved in those riots as well. They were reacting to decades of ill treatment by the police, of being characterized by the fact that you come from that area. So you're automatically criminalized. Doesn't matter what color you are. You come from that estate, that's it. This is how you're being treated. But I didn't know that. I didn't know that story about Bristol. I know they had riots in the early 80s because, like I said before, you know, when we screened The Heart Stop, we did a tour of the country. We screened it in Bristol. We screened it twice. And obviously that film's about the 2011 riots. It's not only about the 2011 riots, that film's also about the 1985 Broadwater Farm riot. And that's when I found out from members of the audience who watched the film about the history in Bristol and the riots.
I'm sure, you know, I'll be surprised if he isn't going to cover that. But what I think you're saying is really interesting, because that, you know, I know somebody who was good mates with Darcus Howe, and he was a white geezer, an political activist, but he always said, you know, that there were good links in and around Notting Hill at the time. So, but the other thing to say, I think is really important, is that when I interviewed a large number of rioters from the period, both black and white, and what was interesting about the white rioters from working class estates like Knoll West and Southmead is that they had massive, you know, they, like you said, their areas were kind of area policed, you know, quite differently to other areas of Bristol. But what they all said was, when we were with our black mates, we always knew they were going to be treated worse than us. We were treated badly, but they were treated worse. And there was a lot of consciousness of that, I think, in certain subcultures, definitely.
Yeah, you know, from episode 1, there's just no, I can see they're kind of queuing it up. They're queuing it up already, because I think they kind of, in episode 1, they cover the fact that this fight, because the New Cross fire was an arson attack, and there'd been plenty of arson attacks, racist, racially motivated arson attacks at that time. And you were already starting to have a division, I guess, amongst the white working class, which became an all-out war. I don't know if you might be involved in it, but an all-out war on the streets between National Front and your, what they call the Anti-Nazi League, or you know, and that was it. It was an all-out battle at that time. And I remember sort of, you know, because I'm old enough to remember things like Two-Tone, and I kind of fancied myself as for a hot minute as a rude boy. So I listened to the Selector and the Beat and the Specials, and you know, Bad Manners somewhat, and that. So I kind of remember that era.
Fantastic. It struck me, it's brilliant that you brought up what Darcus said about, you know, about the jury and having white working class people is the next best thing to having black people there, because rewatching the film today, that really, really struck me. And the whole political narrative now is so against, you know, the black working class is always in opposition to white working class, when there's there's a complete false dichotomy, and they're not in opposition at all. And there you have Dar Patel knowing that and using it in his case, in his trial in the end of 1971. People in the chat are asking, they'd really like to know what you're up to next, what you're working on at the moment, and what's in the pipeline.
I would like to know what I'm working next, as well. I'm just trying to find out the answer to that question. But I've got 3 drama scripts that I'm developing, and a documentary series that I'm trying to get off the ground about the history of institutional racism in Britain, which wants to look at the history in terms of, I would like it to look at how much progress has been made and how much still needs to be made, kind of thing. And also as a response to the Sewell report, which someone I know, an old friend of mine, is one of the people on that Sewell report, a good friend of mine. I haven't seen him for a few years, and I'm going to be meeting up with him soon. You know, not to have fisticuffs, but you know, that report. It seems the last I heard, I was just at the Sheffield Documentary Film Festival over the weekend to curate some films, and I saw David Olusoga talk, and it was a great talk, and it was great to meet him as well. But he said the subject matter of the Sewell report came up, and he said that apparently the latest thing is that Tony Sewell himself is now trying to distance himself from elements of that report. I mean, the thing, it seems, has been discredited from all sides. I mean, not all sides, obviously, because we know that, you know, there's this culture war, and for a lot of people, and Boris, who I think is actually really quite a smart operator. I think the bumbling fool thing is just part of the deception. So he knows what he's doing, putting on that report now. And he's got a lot of his old buddies from the mayor's office to come along and do it. But a lot of them are now saying, well, hang on a minute, that's been taken out of context. So, you know, I think this is a good time to do a documentary series looking at the history of institutional racism in this country, and finding out, you know, defining how what it actually is and what it has been, and historically, and then bring it all the way to up to the present moment, because you can trace it all back, whether it's with policing, you can trace the sus law all the way back, and you can actually go as far as slavery. You know, I didn't know some of this stuff. Modern policing was born out of the slave patrols, the British slave patrols in the Caribbean. Certain aspects of preventative policing. You know, you can look at medicine. We look at what's recently happened today with, with the pandemic and the shocking disparities in terms of you know, the outcomes of fatalities amongst people of color, and to trace that all the way back in terms of the history of medicine as an institution. You know, so we've been trying to get that series off the ground. At the moment, we can't get arrested.
That's ironic.
I'm used to that. Yeah, I'm used to that. That's what it's happened. That's been historical for me as well. That's what happened with the hard stop. Our first bit of funding for the hard stop didn't come from Britain. It came from America.
Wow. Why? I mean, I had a question that I haven't asked you that was about, do you think there are enough opportunities for Black people to work in the TV and film industry? Do you think that would have a difference? Do you think people don't see the value in these stories?
I just want to keep my answer really short here and say, sorry, just repeat the question. Do I think that...
Do you know, you lecture, don't you, in documentary filmmaking? Yeah. So do you think, you know, you've come up through to be a filmmaker? Do you think there are enough opportunities for other people of color?
I think there are more opportunities, Rosie, but I don't think there's enough. I just, you know, and then in the end, I can only really talk from my own experience, and, you know, what I like to say to people in situations like this is that I consider myself at this stage in my career to be a well-balanced individual, because I've got an equal-sized chip on each shoulder. But yeah, it's not, you know, I also have to remember and remind myself that it's not easy for anyone to pursue this career and to make films. And I know that I've been very fortunate to have made the films that I've made and to have had the career I've had. But I've also I just find it amazing how hard it continues to be, you know, and the knockbacks just continue, and the feeling of always coming back to kind of where you were before, which is you've just got to make this happen and do it yourself, not wait for someone to give you permission or to give you the endorsement, because it just doesn't really happen like that, you know. What seems to happen is once you get to a position where, look, we're doing this anyway, that's when you get, you know, the sort of mainstream group saying, okay, well, we better get involved because we don't want to be embarrassed. That kind of happened with the Hard Stop. But I say that, you know, the Hard Stop was eventually funded by the BFI by way of Sundance, who originally funded it, and Bertha were involved, and the brilliant Doc Society were also involved. And then it got, it was licensed to Netflix for about 3 years. It's from 2015 to about 2018, and it's no longer on Netflix, and it still hasn't had a British broadcast. And we're coming up now to August the 6th, and that will be the 10-year anniversary. And I'm still, you know, I've got some phone calls to make this week to try and see, can we get this film shown? It got a BAFTA nomination. You know, this is why I said I want to keep my answers short, because I don't want to start getting into rant and you know, because I had
no idea it hadn't had a British broadcast. That's appalling. It's an amazing film. Everyone should watch it.
Thank you.
So I watched it on BFI Film Player recently, in case anyone else wants to.
Yeah, you can watch it on Amazon as well. But yeah, it's on
Player
as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. So we've got a suggestion for you for future projects from Steve, from our audience. He says it would be great to make a documentary about two-tone from the point of view of the fans, which is hugely politically important in my view. Could that be a project for your future?
Yeah, definitely. I know Don Lex has covered it, but only on some, you know, on one of those BBC 4 kind of, you know, music kind of things, celebrate music. But two-tone from the point of view of the war on the streets that was going on, with Roger touched on. That's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I went to a very white, huge, rural, comprehensive school, and it had a massive impact there. So I'd be really interested in that. Yeah.
Two-tone was, you know, that was a British thing, wasn't it? That was a British thing, and there was a time when, and also it came at a time when, you know, the interesting thing is you know, I remember obviously you know, you had to cross the road certain times, certain types of individual walking towards you, and you were a 12-year-old kid, you're black, someone's walking towards you and they've got the bother boots on and all the rest of it. But you know, I subsequently found out, and you know, I watched documentaries, and actually, well, that skinhead fashion culture was born out of Jamaican music, out of ska. And then the National Front then co-opted the look, unfortunately. And again, it seems to me that the white working class was, once again, a lot of them were, as far as I was concerned, as looking back, were hoodwinked by politicians. Like, well, you've got to blame someone for the fact that there's so much unemployment and there's so much poverty. We're talking about the 70s, and well, what about, let's blame those black and brown people. Well, how about blaming the politicians, the people who are supposed to be actually running the country, the so-called leaders? But you know, we see this time and time again. But you know, and so you had a lot of that, you know, the National Front and that resurgence, and a lot of take up of that. But then you had a backlash against that, and that's where two-tone came in. It's a very good, and I don't believe a documentary of that sort's done. And if I was involved in that, it wouldn't be a 60-minute film or a 90-minute film. That would be a series. So yeah, maybe we should.
Amazing.
About that.
I don't think I would be here listening to this tonight if it hadn't been for the two-tone movement in the late 70s, early 80s, I would say.
Yeah. yeah. It hasn't been done. I've got a feeling it'll be covered somewhat in this Uprising series. I've got a feeling they will cover it somewhat.
And Becky in the chat referencing Shane Meadows' work as well as something that's what This Is England. He deals with the the skinhead side of things, and again the reality of where that came from. Yeah. I think there was an earlier question that I've missed from Mike, which was asking what you feel the situation is now between white working class and black activists.
I really don't know the answer to that question. I think there's this strange situation at the moment with what's called the culture wars, and on the one side you've got the woke brigade, and you've got that question is suddenly what flashed into my mind was last summer, wasn't it? And the Colston statue came down, and then I think a few weekends later there was some notion about, well, what about Churchill? And then you had I just shouldn't laugh, but I was driving out of London for some reason, I can't remember, and so I drove past, and there was groups of lads who'd obviously been there. It was a sunny day. They'd been there from opening out the pub opening. I don't know what time, 10 o'clock, whatever. I've never been a pub person. By now it's 2, 3 o'clock. They're all pissed out, and they're standing around Churchill, and they're ready for the second version of the Battle of Britain or something. And I personally don't think Churchill. I can see that. I know someone here is called Churchill's a wrong un or something, but I personally don't leave the statue alone. Hey, he was involved in what he played a significant part in defeating the tyranny of Nazism in Germany, but he also did some very wrong things in terms of Britain's colonial history and his role in India, for instance. And sometimes we have to live, and this is why I make documentaries, we have to live with the paradox that this is true and this is true at the same time. These two opposing views, actually, sometimes you've got to kind of live with the fact that they both belong together, deal with the fact. And that's what people seem to have a problem with. Sorry, I'm getting a bit passionate now, but that's why I like to make documentaries, and that's why I want the police to be involved in my documentary about the Black Power movement.
Great. I think there's one more question from Roger, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap things up.
It was just a quick comment about that, George, because they were talking about the counter demonstration that happened after the Colston statue was pulled down, which happened about a week after. And some of my mates from the history group, actually, Ian, I don't think he's here tonight, but he went down with a couple of mates to actually have a chat with the people who were supposedly defending the war memorial. And it was very interesting what some of the younger people said who were there. So they'd been told that Black Lives Matter demonstrators were going to, graffiti the war memorial.
Yeah.
And what they said, so Ian said, well, what do you think about the Colston thing then? And they said, oh, no, that was all right.
Yeah.
No, that was fine pulling him down. We're just defending the war memorial.
I know. It
was a bit of a mixed bag, because a lot of people said, oh, they're all far right and all this. Well, obviously there were some of them, but there'd been a lot of bullshit said as well. You know what I mean?
I know. And then what happens is all you hear, and then what gets reported in the news is this lot who are on this side, right on this edge of the debate, and then that lot, and what gets missed is, well, there's a lot in the middle. And there's some people who actually take on board, well, yeah, this and this at the same time, and that doesn't seem to be, what you've just said is, that wasn't really reported in the news, and unfortunately, and it's just a lot of time it is just the minority of that group who are making a lot of noise and doing, basically causing, problems. That then get covered and then become representative of some kind of movement, I think,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the way they framed it was, one of them said, oh, you know, my great granddad died in the First World War. So you can imagine there's an emotional relationship to the war memorial. But the question is, how much is there an emotional relationship to Edward Colston or to even Churchill?
Yeah.
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Final comment from Rosie, the other Rosie.
Thanks for letting me speak. I know you want to finish up. I just wanted to say that, you know, George was speaking earlier about, you know, the Seoul Report and institutional racism, and the documentary he's going to be making about the arguments around that. You know, in 2010, Brecon Council put up a plaque to a slave trader. You know, it's still here, you know, it's still happening today. It was chucked in the river, by the way, in the river Usk, the same weekend as the Colston statue. And he was the captain of the slave ship, the Hannibal. And it's incredible, isn't it, to think in 2010, they're still erecting these plaques and statues.
You know, it's one of those things, because again, I'm sorry to I sound like a stuck record, but you know, the paradox of Colston was he played a large part in the formation of the beautiful city of Bristol. You know, I honestly, I love Bristol. Every time I go there, I don't know if it's something in the water supply or something, but people in Bristol just seem to be cool people. And furthermore, I remember that, you know, the music that came out there once upon, you know, there was a hip hop scene and Tricky and Massive Attack. We started off as a wild bunch, by the way, back in the days. But at the same time, that city was built off slavery. It was built off slavery, and that is part of the history of this country. And you know, it's not, I don't think it's about shame and about bashing people over with a guilt stick. It's just about, look, let's just be honest, and let's look at what's at the past and see how that can make us avoid certain mistakes in the future. And you know, no one wants to see riots kicking off, and this is a problem. And I understand in some ways why you've got these people who also feel like, well, what are you trying to do? You know, are we bashing up Britain? Are we, you know, and it's like, well, no one wants to bash up Britain. We've been through a lot recently as a country. It was just like the whole world. We're dealing with this horrific pandemic, which is threatening to have the same amount of deaths, casualty lists as the Second World War. So no one wants to, you know, we want to feel proud, but I think we can do that as well. We can feel proud as a country, because I think Britain is way ahead in terms of race relations. You know, we were talking about this earlier in terms of, you know, and let's keep going. Let's keep going. Let's keep having that conversation, because there's countries in Europe. I only have to go across the channel and go to France and go to Germany or Portugal, Spain, Italy, and it's like, oh wow, I'm glad I'm not a black person in this country. I'm glad I was born in Britain. At least we're having, you know, we're making some progress. We're having a debate, as difficult as it is sometimes.
Thank you very, very, very much indeed, George. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you and hearing your views and hearing about the amazing work you've done. So I can't thank you enough from the whole of the Bristol Radical History Group, and we hope we'll come back again and hear from you when you produce your next amazing bit of work.
Thank you very much, Rosie. The last thing I'll say is that honestly, I thought I could do this and try and say as little as possible, and I'm very conscious of saying a lot more than I intended to say, but I've just found very engaged. I've been very engaged by the kind of things, questions people have asked, and I'm really grateful to you guys for watching Black Power. And yeah, you know, if anyone's interested, the Enslaved is also on the BBC iPlayer, and if anyone hasn't seen it, the Hard Stops on Amazon Prime, and also the BFI player.
Also, we look forward to seeing you in person down here.
Well, Okay, Roger. I'll wait for my invitation then.
Good.
Lovely. All right, thank you very much. You might want to have a look in the chat function, George. There are many thanks for you from the listeners. So lovely. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining the final session of this brilliant fortnight of historical events to mark the anniversaries of George Floyd's murder and today's anniversary of the statue going in the river. So I think that's been a great final event. So thank you very much and goodbye.